Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of medieval desire, where the church banned certain foods not because they were poisonous, but because they were far too pleasurable. Imagine this: monks hidden behind stone walls, sneaking bites of ginger-spiced meat in the dead of night, terrified not of poison, but of their own bodies responding to warmth, to flavour, to life itself. These were the forbidden recipes that could never be written down, the ingredients that turned holy men into sinners, and the ultimate paradox of the Middle Ages. The more they tried to kill desire, the more powerfully it burned. Now, before we slip into this deliciously forbidden world together, I want to ask you something. If this story pulls you in, if it makes you see the Middle Ages in a completely different light, would you take just a second to subscribe? Maybe hit that like button when something surprises you tonight. And I am genuinely curious. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. I love knowing that we are scattered across the world, but gathered here for the same story. All right, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe light a candle if you are feeling atmospheric, and let us step back in time together. The year is 1136. In a quiet valley in Scotland, a group of men in rough wool robes are building what will become Melrose Abbey. They are Cistercians, a strict order of monks who follow the rule of Saint Benedict, but with a twist. They have made it even harsher. While Benedictine monks might occasionally enjoy a piece of meat or a well-spiced dish on feast days, the Cistercians have stripped their lives down to the absolute essentials. Their days begin before dawn with prayers in the freezing cold. Their meals are simple: coarse bread, vegetables from their own gardens, perhaps some beans or peas, no meat, no rich sauces, and absolutely, positively no exotic spices. You might be wondering why. What is so dangerous about a little pepper, a pinch of cinnamon, or some fresh ginger root? Well, according to medieval medical theory, everything. You see, the medieval world operated on something called humoral theory. Your body contained 4 humours, 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Everything you ate could shift the balance of these humours, and that balance determined not just your physical health, but your spiritual state, your emotions, and yes, your desires. Foods were categorized as hot or cold, wet or dry. And here is where it gets interesting. The foods that were considered hot and moist were believed to generate what they delicately called seed. In modern terms, we would say these foods were thought to increase sexual desire and function. Fresh meat, for instance, was considered dangerously heating to the blood. Wine warmed the body and loosened inhibitions, but spices were the most dangerous of all: ginger, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, fenugreek, basil, mint, saffron. These were not just seasonings. In the medieval mind, they were weapons of lust. Tiny aromatic grenades that could explode the careful balance a monk had worked years to achieve. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential Cistercian leaders, wrote in a sermon about the Song of Songs, "I abstain from meat because by overfeeding the body I also feed carnal desires. I strive to take even bread with moderation, lest my heavy stomach hinder me in standing up for prayer." Can you imagine living like that? Every meal calculated not for pleasure or even nutrition, but to suppress the most basic human impulses. The Cistercians believed that if they kept their diet cold and dry, if they filled their stomachs with lettuce and cucumbers and plain fish, they could literally extinguish the fire in their loins. It was biological warfare against their own bodies. But here is the thing about forbidden fruit: it tastes so much sweeter. And we know this because the historical record is full of monks who could not quite stick to the plan. There is a wonderful story recorded by Gerald of Wales, a 12th century cleric with a sharp eye for hypocrisy. He tells us about Abbot John of Battle, who decided to visit a Cistercian abbey in Sussex. This would have been Robertsbridge Abbey, founded in 1176, the only Cistercian house in the county. Now Abbot John arrived unannounced, as visiting abbots sometimes did, to see how strictly the brothers were following their rule. The Abbot of Robertsbridge greeted him warmly in the cloister, showing him around the grounds, the church, the dormitory. But when they approached the refectory, the dining hall, something strange happened. The Cistercian abbot suddenly became very insistent that they skip this part of the tour. He guided Abbot John away, suggested they visit the gardens instead, perhaps the scriptorium, anything but the refectory. Well, you can imagine what this did to Abbot John's curiosity. The more the Cistercian abbot tried to steer him away, the more determined he became to see what was behind that door. Finally, he managed to slip past his host and push open the refectory door, and there, spread across the tables where the servers were dining, was a feast that would make a medieval nobleman jealous. Platters of roasted meat, rich gravies, and wine spiced with expensive imported seasonings. Gerald tells us that Abbot John, with just a touch of sarcasm, turned to the embarrassed Cistercian abbot and asked him to which saint these relics, meaning the picked clean meat bones, belonged. It is a delicious moment of court hypocrisy, and it reveals something profound. The rules were so strict that even the men enforcing them could not follow them. This was not an isolated incident. The records from medieval monasteries are peppered, if you will pardon the pun, with examples of monks bending or breaking the dietary rules. At Kirkstall Abbey in Yorkshire, archaeologists have found evidence of a meat kitchen, a separate building where meat could be prepared for the sick and for guests. But the very existence of this building, with its massive fireplaces and cooking equipment, suggests that meat was eaten more often than the rule technically allowed. The General Chapter of the Cistercian Order, the governing body that met annually to discuss problems and issue regulations, had to repeatedly remind monasteries that luxurious food should not be served on 3 consecutive days. Think about that for a moment. They had to create a rule limiting special feast foods to every other day or so, which means monasteries were clearly serving them much more often than that. Now, let us talk about what was actually forbidden. The list is fascinating because it reads like a medieval cookbook of pleasure. Meat, obviously, was the big one. The rule of St. Benedict, written way back in 516, limited meat consumption for all monks, and the Cistercians took this to an extreme. Absolutely no meat except for the seriously ill and dying, even lard was forbidden. But spices, that is where it gets really interesting. Luxury spices like pepper and cumin were explicitly discouraged. These were expensive, yes, imported from the Far East along dangerous trade routes. But the real reason they were forbidden had nothing to do with cost. It was because they were believed to inflame the passions. Medieval medical texts are very clear about this. Foods that were pungent, aromatic and warming to the body were thought to directly increase sexual desire. And it was not just theory. In convents across Europe, lists of forbidden foods were drawn up specifically because of their aphrodisiac properties. Basil, mint, cinnamon, cardamom, ginger, saffron and vanilla all appear on these lists, right alongside meat and wine. Think about what this meant for the people living under these rules. Every meal was an act of spiritual discipline. Every bite of plain bread was a victory over the flesh. But it also meant that food itself became charged with a kind of erotic power. The simple act of eating something flavorful became transgressive, dangerous, thrilling. And here is where we see the great paradox. By trying to eliminate desire through diet, the medieval church actually created an entire culture of forbidden pleasures. Spices became associated with sin, with luxury, with the worldly pleasures that monks were supposed to renounce. which meant that when people outside the monastery encountered these same spices, they came wrapped in an aura of the forbidden. This is not just speculation. We have records showing exactly how the wealthy used this knowledge. Medieval medical texts, which we will dive deeper into later in this series, contain detailed instructions about which foods to eat to increase fertility and desire. And guess what is on that list? All the same foods the monks were forbidden to touch: fresh meat, pepper, wine, egg yolks, and aromatic spices. It is almost as if the church created its own opposition. By declaring certain foods dangerous to chastity, they basically gave everyone else a roadmap to passion. The Forbidden Garden was not Eden with its apple tree. It was the monastery garden, and the forbidden fruit was ginger root. Let me share one more detail that really brings this home. At the wealthy Benedictine abbeys, the ones that were not quite as strict as the Cistercians, we have actual menus that survive. Food historian Ivan Day has reconstructed some of these from medieval manuscripts, and they are extraordinary. Even though meat was theoretically limited, the monks found creative ways around this. Fish was allowed, so they ate it in abundance. Mussels cooked with leeks and spicy Saracen sauce. Crab meat fried in olive oil and scrambled into eggs. Oysters prepared a dozen different ways. And these dishes were heavily spiced with ginger, saffron, and pepper. One recipe for cordelle of mussels calls for mussels steamed in white wine, seasoned with leeks, onions, ginger, and a generous pinch of saffron finished with a dollop of cream. Saffron, by the way, was worth more than its weight in gold in the Middle Ages. A wealthy monastery using it liberally in a fish stew was not just feeding its monks. It was making a statement about power, prestige, and yes, probably enjoying the warming, arousing properties that saffron was known for. The irony is beautiful, is it not? The same institutions that preached abstinence and self-denial were creating some of the most sophisticated, sensual cuisine in medieval Europe. Behind their walls, in their private dining halls, they were experimenting with exotic spices and rich preparations that would make a modern chef proud. And the ordinary people noticed. When pilgrims visited monasteries, when merchants delivered supplies, when nobles came to dine with abbots, they saw and smelled and sometimes tasted this food. They learned what the forbidden flavours were, and they wanted them too. This created a kind of culinary arms race. The church said spices were dangerous. The wealthy said, well then, we definitely want them. Cookbooks from the 13th and 14th centuries onward are full of recipes using the exact same ingredients that were forbidden in monasteries. Heavily spiced wine drinks, meat dishes drowning in pepper and cinnamon, desserts perfumed with expensive aromatics. There is something deeply human about all of this. The moment you tell someone they cannot have something, especially if you give them a really good reason, like it will make you too passionate, you have basically guaranteed they're going to want it more. The medieval church, in trying to create a system of perfect control over human desire, accidentally created the world's most effective marketing campaign for aphrodisiacs. Think about it. If some random medieval merchant told you that ginger would spice up your love life, you might be skeptical. But if the entire religious establishment of Europe is so terrified of ginger that they ban it from monasteries because it is too sexually powerful, well, now you are listening. Now you are pulling out your coin purse at the spice market. This is the foundational paradox we are going to explore throughout this series. The forbidden is always the most desired, and the medieval world with its elaborate systems of prohibition and control created a culture absolutely obsessed with the very desires it was trying to suppress. As we close this first chapter of our journey, I want you to imagine walking through a medieval monastery garden at dusk. The air is cool, the light is fading, and all around you are the herbs the monks grow for medicine and for their sparse meals. Sage, rosemary, thyme, innocent plants, healing plants. But just beyond the wall, in the market towns and noble estates, those same plants are being combined with forbidden spices, mixed into love potions, baked into foods meant to kindle passion. The same world, the same ingredients, but completely different intentions. And somewhere in between, monks are sneaking bites of spiced meat and pretending they did not enjoy it. We have only begun to scratch the surface of medieval aphrodisiacs. We have talked about why certain foods were forbidden, but we have not yet talked about what happened when people actually used them. We have not discussed the recipes that were considered so powerful, so dangerous that they were passed down in whispers and hidden manuscripts. We have not met the queens who drank mule urine in desperation, or the plants that screamed when you pulled them from the earth, or the beetles that could kill a king. In our next part, we are going to meet one of those plants. Its name is mandrake, and medieval people believed it could drive you insane before it made you passionate. It had roots shaped like a human body, and harvesting it required elaborate rituals involving dogs, ropes, and wax earplugs. It was one of the most sought-after ingredients in medieval love magic, and its story is absolutely wild. So stay with me. Keep those lights low, and let us continue deeper into the Forbidden Garden together. Now, if you thought forbidden spices were the height of medieval obsession, wait until you hear about what people were willing to risk for a single root pulled from the earth. We are talking about a plant so dangerous that simply harvesting it could kill you. A plant with roots that look disturbingly human, that medieval people swore would scream when you pulled it from the soil, and that scream would drive anyone who heard it completely insane. Welcome to the world of mandrake, the most legendary aphrodisiac in European history, and quite possibly the most terrifying vegetable you will ever encounter. Picture this. It is a moonless night somewhere in the English countryside, probably around the year 1300. A man approaches a patch of earth where mandrake is known to grow, but he is not alone. He has brought a dog with him, a rope, and his ears are stuffed with wax. What happens next sounds like something from a fever dream, but this was considered the safest, most reasonable way to harvest this plant. The man carefully digs around the mandrake root, loosening the soil but never pulling the plant free. Then he ties one end of the rope to the base of the plant and the other end to the dog's collar. He places food just out of the dog's reach. And then, with his ears still plugged with wax, he backs away and calls to the dog. The hungry animal lunges for the food, yanking the mandrake from the earth. And according to every medieval text on the subject, the moment that root comes free, the plant releases a shriek so terrible that anyone who hears it will either die on the spot or go irreversibly mad. The dog, tragically, was considered an acceptable loss. Now you're probably thinking, this is obvious superstition, right? No plant actually screams, and you would be correct. But here is what makes this fascinating. The mandrake ritual was taken so seriously that it appears in medical texts, herbals, and even legal documents throughout the Middle Ages. This was not fringe belief. This was mainstream medieval science. The plant we are talking about is Mandragora officinarum, and it has been famous since biblical times. It is mentioned in the book of Genesis, where Rachel trades a night with Jacob to Leah in exchange for mandrake roots that Leah's son has found. Even back then, thousands of years ago, people believed this plant could cure infertility and kindle desire. By the time we get to medieval Europe, that reputation has only grown stronger and stranger. Here is why mandrake was so prized. The roots naturally fork and branch in ways that can look remarkably like a human body, complete with what appears to be legs, arms, and even a head. And medieval people took this resemblance very seriously. You see, they believed in something called the doctrine of signatures, the idea that God had marked plants with visual clues about their purpose. A walnut looks like a brain, so it must be good for your head. A bean looks like a kidney, so it treats kidney problems. And mandrake, which looks like a tiny human, well, clearly it must affect human fertility and passion. But it gets weirder. Medieval herbalists distinguish between male and female mandrake plants. The male mandrakes had roots that forked like legs, while the female plants had a more rounded, fuller form. And the gender of the plant you use was supposed to matter for different kinds of love magic. Some recipes specifically called for male mandrake if you were a woman seeking to attract a man, and vice versa. The actual botanical reality is that mandrake does contain powerful alkaloid compounds, including scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine. These are the same chemicals found in deadly nightshade, and they are absolutely not something you want to ingest casually. In small doses, they can cause hallucinations, rapid heartbeat, and a sense of euphoria. In slightly larger doses, they cause delirium, convulsions, and death. So while mandrake is not actually an aphrodisiac in any scientific sense, it is definitely psychoactive, which might explain why people who took it reported such intense experiences. Let me share some actual medieval recipes that have survived. One 13th century text instructs the user to dig up a mandrake root on a Friday at dawn, wash it in wine, wrap it in silk, and wear it as an amulet to ensure fertility. Another recipe, this one from a 15th century manuscript, tells you to slice the root very thin, dry it in the shade, grind it to powder and mix it with honey and wine. The dose recommended would probably be enough to give you vivid hallucinations, which the text describes as visions of your true love. But the really extreme recipes, the ones that have survived mostly in fragmentary form because they were considered dangerous knowledge, combined mandrake with other even more disturbing ingredients. Powdered bone, for instance. Hair from the person you desired, specifically from intimate areas of their body, and in what might be the most unsettling detail, menstrual blood. Now, before you recoil completely, we need to understand the logic here. Medieval people believed that love potions worked best when they contained something from both the person casting the spell and the person being enchanted. This was called contagious magic, the idea that things that have been in contact maintain a connection even when separated. So if you could get a hair from your beloved's head, or better yet from somewhere more private, and combine it with your own bodily essence, you created a magical link. Mandrake was the catalyst in these mixtures, the ingredient that activated everything else. One particularly detailed recipe from a 14th century grimoire instructs the reader to take a small piece of mandrake root, a nail clipping from the beloved, 3 drops of the spellcaster's blood, and hair from both parties. These were to be wrapped in a small cloth pouch with rose petals and buried at a crossroads under a full moon. After 3 nights, you were supposed to dig it up, burn it, and mix the ash into wine that you would then somehow get your target to drink. The complications here are obvious. How exactly were you supposed to obtain nail clippings and hair from someone who did not know you were creating a love spell? Well, that is where things got creative and more than a little creepy. Servants might be bribed to collect such things from their noble employers. A determined suitor might steal a ribbon or a glove and carefully extract hairs from it. There are even court records of people being accused of theft because they had taken combs or clothing items for exactly this purpose. And mandrake was expensive enough that possessing it was itself noteworthy. In 1295, the inventory of a wealthy merchant in London listed a mandrake root as one of his valuable possessions, right alongside silver plate and fine fabrics. When he died, that root was appraised at a value equivalent to several weeks of a skilled worker's wages. The danger of mandrake extended beyond the screaming root legend. Because of its psychoactive properties, it was frighteningly easy to accidentally poison someone with it. Medieval medical texts contain warnings about this. One physician, writing in the early 14th century, described a case where a man had given his wife a love potion containing mandrake, and she had fallen into a deep sleep that lasted 3 days. When she woke, she could not remember her own name, and seemed to have lost several years of her memory. The text rather pointedly notes that the husband was much distressed by this outcome. I imagine he was. Nothing says I love you quite like accidental brain damage. There are also darker stories. In 1324, a woman in Norwich was brought before the church courts accused of using mandrake to bewitch a local priest. The details are fragmentary, but apparently she had managed to get him to drink wine she had prepared, and afterward he became obsessed with her, abandoning his duties and spending all his time at her house. When other priests investigated, they found a mandrake root hidden in her garden, and that was considered proof enough of witchcraft. We do not know what happened to her, but in that era such accusations rarely ended well. But here is what I find most fascinating. Despite all the danger, despite the risk of madness or death or accusation of witchcraft, people kept using mandrake for centuries. Why? What was so compelling about this plant that people were willing to risk everything for it? Part of it was surely the mystery and ritual surrounding it. Getting mandrake was itself an adventure, almost a quest. You had to know where it grew, which was secret knowledge passed down from herbalists and root cutters. You had to perform the elaborate harvesting ritual. You had to prepare it correctly. And all of this gave the plant a kind of power before you even used it. By the time you finally consumed your mandrake potion or wore your mandrake amulet, you'd invested so much effort, so much belief that of course it was going to work. This is the placebo effect at its most powerful, and the medieval world, with its love of symbolism and ritual, was perfectly designed to maximize that effect. Every step of the process reinforced the idea that you were dealing with something extraordinary, something that could change your fate. There is also the simple fact that the alternatives were not great. If you were a woman in medieval Europe struggling with infertility, your options were extremely limited. You could pray, obviously. You could go on pilgrimage to shrines associated with fertility. You could consult physicians who would bleed you or prescribe bizarre diets. Or you could turn to folk magic and plants like mandrake. For many women, especially those without access to expensive doctors, mandrake represented hope. Dangerous hope, perhaps, but hope nonetheless. And for men dealing with what medieval texts delicately called insufficiency, the situation was even more fraught. Male virility was tied directly to honor and masculinity in medieval culture. A man who could not perform his marital duties was subject to mockery and even legal challenges. Wives could and did petition for annulments on the grounds that their marriages had not been consummated. So men facing this problem were desperate for solutions, and mandrake, with its human-shaped roots and ancient reputation, seemed like an answer. The plant appears over and over in medieval literature, always with this aura of dangerous power. In The Romance of the Rose, a 13th century French poem that was wildly popular across Europe, mandrake is mentioned as one of the ingredients in a love potion so powerful it can make someone fall in love against their will. The poem treats this as both thrilling and slightly horrifying, which is probably the right response. Shakespeare, writing at the very end of our period and into the Renaissance, still references mandrake in several plays. In Romeo and Juliet, Juliet worries about waking up too early in the tomb and going mad, or hearing, as 'tis said, where the screaming mandrake's torn from the earth, that mortals hearing them run mad. The fact that Shakespeare could reference this in a play performed in London in 1597 and expect his audience to immediately understand shows just how deeply embedded mandrake lore was in European culture. But let us return to the actual practices, because here is where it gets really interesting. Mandrake was not just used in potions you drank. It was also worn as an amulet, carried in small pouches hung around the neck or tucked into clothing. The idea was that the plant's power would radiate outward, affecting your fertility and desirability just by being close to your body. There are records of women wearing mandrake amulets to bed on their wedding nights, believing it would ensure both pleasure and conception. Some amulets were quite elaborate, with the dried root carved into a more recognizably human shape and dressed in tiny clothes. These were called poppets in English, and they were treated almost like dolls, sometimes even given names. And here is a detail that really brings home how seriously this was taken. In some regions, families would pass down mandrake roots as heirlooms. A particularly well-formed root, one that really did look remarkably human, might be treasured for generations, loaned out to daughters and granddaughters on their wedding nights, displayed proudly as a symbol of the family's fertility and good fortune. Of course, this also meant that if a family fell on hard times, if marriages failed to produce children, or if children died young, the mandrake could be blamed. And then it would be quietly buried or burned or sold, and the family would start over with a new root, a new hope. The church's position on all of this was complicated. Officially, using plants for their medicinal properties was acceptable. God had created plants for human use, after all, but using them for magic, for compelling love or desire, that was absolutely forbidden. That was stepping into the territory of witchcraft and demonic influence. Yet the line between medicine and magic was blurry at best. If you took mandrake to treat infertility, that was medicine. If you took it to make your husband desire you more, that was, well, was that medicine too? Or was it magic? Different church authorities gave different answers, and ordinary people mostly just did what they thought would work and tried not to get caught. What I find most poignant about all of this is the sheer human need driving it. These were not evil people trying to work dark magic. These were ordinary men and women dealing with the very same struggles people face today. The desire to be loved, the fear of being alone, the desperate wish for children, the quiet terror of inadequacy. They just happened to live in a world where the solutions involved dogs, ropes, and screaming vegetables. The mandrake trade was real and extensive. Roots were harvested in the warmer parts of Europe, particularly around the Mediterranean, and shipped north to England, France, and Germany. There were professional mandrake hunters who knew where the plants grew and who had presumably worked out harvesting methods that did not actually require sacrificing a dog every time. These were tightly guarded trade secrets passed from master to apprentice worth real money. And because genuine mandrake was expensive and sometimes hard to obtain, there was a thriving market in fakes. Unscrupulous merchants would carve briny roots, which are much more common, into human shapes and sell them as mandrake. Some of these fakes were quite elaborate, with features carefully carved and hair inserted into drilled holes to make them look more convincing. Buyers had to be careful, and there were tests described in herbals to distinguish true mandrake from counterfeits. As we move forward through our exploration of medieval aphrodisiacs, keep mandrake in mind. It represents something essential about how these substances worked. They were powerful not just because of their chemical properties, but because of the stories surrounding them, the rituals required to obtain them, and the desperate hope people invested in them. Mandrake was never just a plant. It was a lifeline, a prayer, a gamble against fate. And speaking of gambles, we are about to meet an ingredient that was an even bigger risk than mandrake. An ingredient that did not just make you hallucinate or occasionally cause death. No, this next one was almost guaranteed to harm you, and it definitely killed people on a regular basis, including at least one king. But that did not stop it from being one of the most sought-after aphrodisiacs in history, traded across continents and coveted by emperors. I am talking about a beetle a beautiful emerald green beetle that contained a poison so potent that just a tiny amount could kill you. But that same tiny amount could also make you feel more alive than you had ever felt before. The Spanish fly is waiting for us, and trust me, its story is worth the risk. There is something darkly poetic about the fact that one of history's most famous aphrodisiacs is literally called a fly, when it is actually a beetle, and Spanish, when it is found all over southern Europe and North Africa. But names can be deceiving, and in the case of Spanish fly, that deception has cost lives for over 2,000 years. Let me tell you about a death that changed European history. The year is 1516. King Ferdinand II of Aragon, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, the man who along with his wife Isabella had funded Christopher Columbus and completed the Reconquista of Spain, is dying in a castle in Madrigalejo. He is 63 years old, which is actually a decent age for the time, but his death is not peaceful. He's in agony, his kidneys are failing, and his physicians are baffled because just days ago he seemed perfectly healthy. What they do not know, or perhaps what they know but dare not say aloud, is that the king had recently consumed a tonic meant to enhance his performance with his much younger second wife, Germaine de Foix. That tonic, according to court whispers that would circulate for decades after, contained crushed wings of the blister beetle, Spanish fly, and it had killed him. Now we cannot be completely certain this is what happened. Medieval and Renaissance medical records are notoriously vague, and people die of kidney failure for many reasons, but the rumour persisted so strongly that it appears in multiple chronicles of the period, and here is why it was believable. Everyone knew Spanish fly was dangerous. That was part of its appeal. Let me take you back even further, because this substance has a history that stretches back to ancient Rome. Pliny the Elder, the great Roman natural historian who died in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 Anno Domini, wrote about Spanish fly in his encyclopedic natural history. He described it as a powerful medicine that could provoke desire and enhance performance, but he also warned that it was toxic and could cause terrible suffering if misused. Pliny was not exaggerating. The blister beetle, scientifically known as Litter vesicatoria, produces a defensive chemical called cantharidin. When threatened, the beetle secretes this oily substance from its leg joints, and if you touch it or, God forbid, ingest it, it causes severe irritation and blistering wherever it contacts tissue. Hence the name, blister beetle. Here is where it gets both interesting and horrifying. When cantharidin is ingested, it passes through your digestive system largely intact and is eventually excreted through your urinary tract. And as it moves through that system, it causes inflammation and irritation all along the way. This includes increased blood flow to the genitals, which in men can cause prolonged, painful erections, and which medieval and Renaissance doctors interpreted as evidence that the substance was working as an aphrodisiac. But here is the catch. The dose that causes this desirable effect is, and the dose that causes kidney failure and death are frighteningly close. We are talking about a margin of error measured in milligrams. Modern toxicology has determined that as little as 32 milligrams of cantharidin can be fatal to an adult human. To put that in perspective, that is about the weight of a grain of rice. 1 grain of rice worth of this substance, and you are potentially looking at organ failure and death. So when medieval apothecaries prepared Spanish fly tonics, they were quite literally playing with poison, and they knew it. The recipes that survive are full of warnings and precise measurements. One 14th century medical manuscript instructs the preparer to use no more than the weight of 3 grains of barley of dried beetle powder mixed into a cup of wine. Another text says the mixture should be given only to men of robust constitution, and warns that it should never be used more than once in a fortnight. Despite these warnings, or perhaps because of them, Spanish fly became one of the most prestigious aphrodisiacs in the medieval world. It was expensive, it was exotic, and it was dangerous, all of which made it incredibly desirable to exactly the kind of people who could afford it: nobles, wealthy merchants, and royalty. The preparation methods varied, but they were all pretty grim. You had to catch the beetles, which swarm in late spring and early summer. Then you had to kill them, usually by drowning them in vinegar, which also helped preserve them. After that, you dried them, crushed them into powder, and carefully measured out tiny amounts to mix into drinks or pastes. Some recipes called for mixing the beetle powder with other ingredients meant to mask the taste or enhance the effect. Honey was common, both for sweetness and because it was itself considered mildly aphrodisiac. Expensive spices like cinnamon and ginger might be added. Wine was the usual medium for drinking it, though some recipes called for mixing it into food instead. And here is something that really brings home the casual cruelty of the medieval world. Spanish fly was not just used on willing participants. Court records and legal documents from across Europe contain cases of people being poisoned with Spanish fly against their will. Sometimes it was an attempted seduction gone wrong, someone slipping the substance into a drink, hoping it would inflame desire. Other times it was darker, people using it as a way to cause suffering or even death while making it look like something else. The most notorious case, one that shocked Europe and became legendary, involved the Marquis de Sade in 1772. Now we are getting a bit outside our medieval period here, but bear with me because this story perfectly illustrates why Spanish fly maintained its dangerous reputation. The Marquis, already known for his extreme behaviour, hired several prostitutes in Marseille and gave them what he described as aphrodisiac pastilles, little candies. The women became violently ill, vomiting, experiencing terrible abdominal pain and difficulty urinating. They nearly died. When the authorities investigated, the assumption was that the candies had contained Spanish fly, though we actually do not have definitive proof of what was in them. But the fact that everyone immediately jumped to that conclusion tells you something about the substance's reputation. 300 years after King Ferdinand's death, Spanish fly was still the go-to assumption when someone talked about dangerous aphrodisiacs. But let us return to the medieval period and talk about why, despite all the danger, people kept using this stuff. What was the appeal? Why would you risk kidney failure for a night of passion? Part of it comes back to something we have touched on before, the sheer desperation that surrounded fertility and virility in the medieval world. If you were a nobleman who needed an heir, or a merchant trying to prove your manhood, or a woman hoping to conceive after years of disappointment, you would consider risks that seem insane to us now. And Spanish fly had a reputation. It was the aphrodisiac that Roman emperors had used. It appeared in ancient Greek texts. It had this aura of classical authority that medieval people found very persuasive. There is also the simple fact that, in careful doses, it sometimes seemed to work. Remember, it does cause increased blood flow to the genitals. That is a real, measurable physiological effect. The problem is that the same mechanism that causes that effect is also causing tissue damage throughout your urinary and digestive systems. But if you only use it once or twice, if you are lucky with your dosing, you might experience the benefit without immediate catastrophic consequences. Of course, repeated use would almost certainly cause cumulative damage. Medieval doctors did seem to understand this on some level. The texts warn against frequent use, and some specifically note that men who use Spanish fly too often develop problems with urination and kidney pain. But the connection between cause and effect was not always clear, especially if the symptoms showed up weeks or months after use. Let me share a particularly vivid account from a 13th century medical text written by a physician working in Montpellier, one of the great centres of medieval medicine. he describes treating a patient, a wealthy merchant, who'd been using Spanish fly preparations for several months. The merchant came to him complaining of burning pain when urinating, blood in his urine, and severe pain in his lower back. The physician, putting the pieces together, asked if the man had been taking any medicines or tonics. When the merchant admitted he'd been using an aphrodisiac preparation purchased from an apothecary, the doctor immediately suspected Spanish fly. The treatment the physician describes is interesting. He had the man stop taking the tonic immediately, obviously. Then he prescribed a diet of cooling foods, lots of fresh water, and barley water to soothe the urinary tract. He also had the man take sitting baths in lukewarm water infused with chamomile and other soothing herbs. According to the text, the merchant recovered after about a month, but the physician notes grimly that he had seen other cases where patients were not so fortunate. What strikes me about this account is the physician's matter-of-fact tone. He is not shocked that his patient was using Spanish fly. He is not morally outraged. He is just clinically documenting what happened and how he treated it, the way a modern doctor might document a case of alcohol poisoning or drug overdose. This was just part of the landscape of medieval medicine, and Spanish fly was not just a European phenomenon. The substance was known and used in the Islamic world as well, where it was called darira. Arabic medical texts contain recipes and warnings very similar to their European counterparts. The trade routes that brought spices from the East also carried knowledge about aphrodisiacs and poisons, and that knowledge flowed in both directions. In fact, one of the reasons Spanish fly became so prominent in medieval European medicine is because Arabic physicians had written extensively about it. When those texts were translated into Latin in the 11th and 12th centuries, European doctors suddenly had access to centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to prepare and dose the substance. This did not make it safer, but it did make it more widely available and more systematically used. The beetle itself is actually quite beautiful, which adds to the strange poetry of this whole story. Litta vesicatoria is a brilliant emerald green, almost iridescent in sunlight. They are about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch long, with long antennae and a slender body. In the spring and summer, they swarm on ash trees and lilac bushes, sometimes covering the plants so completely that the trees look like they are shimmering with green gems. Can you imagine being a beetle collector in medieval times? You would wake before dawn, head out to the ash groves and carefully gather these beautiful insects, knowing that each one contains a substance that could kill you if you're not careful. Some collectors wore gloves made of thick leather. Others used long tweezers or specially designed tools to avoid touching the beetles directly. And all of this for a product that you would sell to apothecaries, who would sell it to the wealthy and desperate. The economic side of this is fascinating too. Spanish fly was valuable enough that there were regulations about its trade in some cities. In Venice, which was a major centre of the spice and medicine trade, apothecaries had to be licensed to sell Spanish fly, and they were required to keep records of who they sold it to. This was partly about quality control, making sure the product was genuine and properly prepared, but it was also about preventing poisonings, accidental or otherwise. There are also court cases where possession of Spanish fly was used as evidence of intent to harm. In 1398, a woman in Paris was accused of attempting to poison her husband. Among the evidence presented was the fact that she had purchased Spanish fly from an apothecary shortly before her husband became ill. She claimed she had been making a love tonic to improve their relationship, which may well have been true, but the court was not sympathetic. The fact that she had access to the substance was seen as damning. This raises an uncomfortable question that medieval people grappled with too. Is there a meaningful difference between an aphrodisiac and a poison? If you give someone a substance that might inflame their desire, or might kill them depending on the dose, what exactly are you giving them? Medieval philosophers and theologians argued about this. Some said that intent mattered most. If you were trying to help someone overcome a physical problem, that was medicine. If you were trying to manipulate their will or harm them, that was poison or witchcraft. But others pointed out that the substance itself did not care about your intentions. Spanish fly was going to do what Spanish fly does regardless of why you administered it. This ambiguity meant that Spanish fly occupied a strange legal and moral space. It was not quite medicine, not quite poison, not quite magic. It was all three, depending on who was using it and why, and what happened afterward. And that brings us back to King Ferdinand dying in agony in 1516. Whether or not Spanish fly actually killed him, the fact that everyone believed it could have tells us everything we need to know about the substance's reputation. This was the aphrodisiac that kings feared and desired in equal measure. It was power and danger in a small green beetle, crushed into powder and dissolved in wine. The legacy of Spanish fly extends far beyond the medieval period. Even into the 18th and 19th centuries, it was still being sold as an aphrodisiac, though increasingly people understood how dangerous it was. And even today, despite being illegal in most countries, black market products claiming to contain Spanish fly still circulate, still harm people, still trade on that ancient, deadly reputation. What have we learned from mandrake and Spanish fly? That medieval aphrodisiacs were not gentle herbs and pleasant potions. They were serious business, often dangerous, sometimes deadly. The people using them were not naive or foolish. They were desperate, hopeful, and willing to take enormous risks for something they needed or wanted badly enough. But not all medieval aphrodisiac recipes involved poison and peril. Some were stranger, more intimate, and in their own way even more revealing about medieval life and relationships. Because now we need to talk about what medieval wives were doing in their kitchens late at night, when no one else was around. We need to talk about bread dough kneaded on naked skin, honey poured over bodies, and the peculiar idea that the most powerful aphrodisiac was not something you gathered from nature, but something you made from yourself. The body recipes are waiting, and trust me, they are unlike anything we have encountered so far. If mandrake and Spanish fly showed us the dangerous edge of medieval aphrodisiacs, what I'm about to share reveals something far more intimate and, honestly, far more bizarre. Because we're about to enter the private chambers of medieval wives, into kitchens after dark, and discover practices so strange that when male clergy first wrote about them, they could barely believe what they were hearing in confession. Imagine you are a medieval woman, married perhaps a year or two, and you are worried. Your husband seems distracted, uninterested. Maybe he works long hours at his trade and comes home exhausted. Maybe the marriage was arranged and he never developed passion for you. Maybe you're desperate for a child and nothing is happening. You have tried prayers, you have made offerings at the church, you have worn the amulets your mother gave you, but nothing has changed. So you turn to the older women in your community, the ones who whisper advice over the washing or while working wool together. And they tell you something that sounds absurd, even horrifying at first, but they swear it works. They tell you to bake bread, but not ordinary bread. Bread kneaded against your naked body, pressed against your breasts and stomach, absorbing your warmth and your essence. And then you are to bake it and serve it to your husband, and he will become inflamed with desire for you. This is not fiction. This is not some wild fantasy dreamed up by medieval monks. This practice is documented in multiple sources from across Europe, described by confessors who heard about it from women in their parishes, recorded by physicians trying to understand folk medicine, and occasionally appearing in church court records when someone was accused of using improper methods to influence their spouse. The logic behind this, strange as it seems to us, made perfect sense in the medieval worldview. Remember, medieval people believed in a principle we touched on with mandrake. Contagious magic, the idea that things that have been in contact continue to influence each other even when separated. Your body, your sweat, your warmth, these were not just physical things. They carried your essence, your life force, what some texts called your virtue. When you kneaded dough against your skin, according to this belief, the dough absorbed part of you. And when your husband ate that bread, he was consuming you in a very literal, almost sacramental way. He was taking your essence into his body, creating a bond, kindling his desire through this intimate, invisible connection. Dr. Eleanor Janega, a medieval historian at the University of London, has studied these practices extensively, and she points out something fascinating. These recipes almost always came from women. They were passed down through female networks, mother to daughter, older wife to younger. Men might write them down afterward, often with a mixture of fascination and horror. But they were not creating these practices. Women were, and that tells us something important about medieval marriage and desire. These were not practices born from abundance and joy. They came from anxiety, from pressure, from the very real consequences women faced if they failed to produce children or keep their husbands satisfied. A woman who could not conceive might be divorced. A woman whose husband openly kept a mistress might lose her social standing. A widow without children might find herself destitute. The stakes were desperately high. So let us talk about the actual recipes, because they get wilder. The bread method was just the beginning. Another practice documented in a 15th century pastoral manual from Germany involved honey. The woman was instructed to warm honey until it was liquid, pour it over her naked body, let it cool slightly, and then carefully scrape it off and mix it into food or drink for her husband. The text describing this sounds almost clinical until you really think about what it is describing, and then it becomes deeply strange. But here is where it gets even more intimate. Some recipes called for specific bodily fluids. Menstrual blood appears in multiple sources, always described in hushed, coded language. One 14th century manuscript, probably copied from an even older source, instructs women to collect a small amount of menstrual blood, mix it with wine or honey, and find a way to get their husbands to consume it without their knowledge. Now, before we dismiss this as purely superstition or desperation, we need to understand the medieval medical theory behind it. According to humoral medicine, menstrual blood was not waste. It was unformed potential, the raw material from which babies were made. It represented fertility itself. So in the medieval mind, giving your husband your menstrual blood was like giving him liquid fertility, concentrated female power. The same logic applied to other bodily substances. Sweat, for instance. One recipe from a 13th century collection instructs women to place a piece of clean linen against their skin in intimate areas, let it absorb their perspiration overnight, and then use that cloth to wipe the rim of their husband's wine cup before serving him. The idea was that even this indirect contact would create desire. And then there are the recipes involving hair, not head hair, mind you. We are talking about pubic hair, collected carefully and mixed into food or sewn into small pouches and hidden in the husband's clothing or bedding. The reasoning was similar. This was the most intimate, the most essentially feminine part of a woman's body, and therefore it carried the most powerful influence. I can almost hear you thinking, did this actually work? And the answer is complicated. On a purely chemical or pharmacological level, no, of course not. Bread kneaded on skin is still just bread. Honey that touched a body is still just honey. Human hair and bodily fluids have no magic properties, but on a psychological level, that is where it gets interesting. If a wife who had been anxious and withdrawn suddenly became more confident, more attentive to her husband, served him special meals she had prepared with care and intention, that behaviour change itself, might affect the relationship, and if she believed the ritual would work, she might approach her husband differently, with more confidence or expectation, and that could absolutely change the dynamic between them. This is the placebo effect working on both sides of the equation. The woman believes she has done something powerful, so she behaves differently. The husband, if he somehow learned what had happened, might find himself thinking about his wife in a more physical way, simply because she had done this strange, intimate thing involving her body and his food. The power was real even if the mechanism was not what they thought. But here is where things get darker. Not all of these practices were voluntary on the husband's part. In fact, most of them explicitly involved secrecy. The woman was supposed to do these things without her husband knowing, slipping her essence into his food and drink, influencing him without his consent. And medieval moralists were very aware of this problem. Church authorities struggled with how to categorize these practices. Were they medicine? After all, they were meant to help with marital problems and fertility, which physicians also tried to address. Were they magic? They certainly involved rituals and beliefs about invisible powers. Were they sinful manipulation? That was the question that really troubled confessors. The penitential manuals, those handbooks priests used to guide them in hearing confessions and assigning penances, contained specific entries about women using illicit methods to procure love from their husbands. The penances varied but were generally fairly mild, suggesting that the church saw this as misguided rather than truly evil. A woman might be assigned prayers to, say, fasting days or acts of charity. Compare that to the harsh penalties for actual witchcraft, and you can see that authorities made a distinction, but that distinction was not always clear or consistent. In some regions and time periods, using these methods could get you accused of witchcraft, especially if the marriage was prominent or if something went wrong. There is a case from Norwich in 1392 where a woman was brought before the church courts accused of bewitching her husband with food she'd prepared in an improper manner. The records are frustratingly vague about what she actually did, but the outcome was serious. She was forced to do public penance, walking through the town in her undergarments carrying a candle, a humiliating punishment meant to shame her and warn other women. Yet despite the risks, these practices continued for centuries. Why? Because the alternatives were limited, and often worse. A woman could consult a physician, but that was expensive and physicians did not always have better solutions. She could buy expensive ingredients like mandrake or Spanish fly, but those were dangerous and costly. Or she could use what she had, her own body, her own effort, her own intimate knowledge of her household and her husband. There is something poignant about that, is there not? These were women working with the only resources truly under their control: their bodies, their labour, their determination. They were not passive victims waiting for fate or medicine to solve their problems. They were taking action, using the knowledge available to them, trying to shape their own futures. Let me share another practice that shows up repeatedly in the sources, and this one is particularly revealing. Chickpeas. Common, ordinary chickpeas, the kind used in everyday cooking all across the Mediterranean and Middle East. But not just any chickpeas, sprouted chickpeas. Now, why sprouted chickpeas? The medieval explanation was straightforward and in its own way logical. When chickpeas sprout, they send out a small white shoot, and to medieval eyes that shoot looked remarkably like male seed, like sperm. So according to the doctrine of signatures, the principle that things are good for whatever they resemble, sprouted chickpeas must be excellent for male fertility and potency. Dr. Catherine Harvey, a medieval historian at Birkbeck University of London, has written extensively about this. She notes that sprouted chickpeas appear in multiple medieval medical texts as a food to increase male seed production. And women were encouraged to serve them to their husbands, often cooked in warming spices like ginger and pepper to enhance the effect. But here is the twist. Some sources suggest that women would sprout the chickpeas in their own mouths, keeping them tucked in their cheeks for a day or two until they began to germinate and then cook them. This added the same contagious magic element we have seen with the bread and honey. The chickpeas had touched the woman's body, absorbed her essence, and would therefore create a connection when the husband ate them. Can you imagine walking around for 2 days with chickpeas in your mouth, trying to act normal, waiting for them to sprout? The dedication required for that is remarkable, and it speaks to just how important these matters were to medieval women. There were also recipes that combined multiple elements. One particularly elaborate formula from a late medieval grimoire instructs the woman to bake small cakes using flour that has been blessed in church, honey that she has warmed against her skin, rose petals that she has held in her mouth, and her own saliva. These cakes were to be marked with symbols meant to represent love and unity, baked on a Friday during a waxing moon, and fed to the husband while the woman concentrated on her desire for his affection. The combination of Christian elements, like blessed flour, with clearly pagan or magical elements, like moon phases and symbols, is typical of medieval folk practice. Ordinary people did not make sharp distinctions between religion and magic the way theologians did. They used whatever seemed to work, mixing Christian prayers with ancient charms, church rituals with folk wisdom. And the men? What did husbands think about all this? Well, mostly they had no idea it was happening. That was the whole point. But occasionally a man would find out, either through gossip or accident, and the reactions recorded in legal and literary sources are fascinating. Some men were angry, feeling manipulated or bewitched. Others were apparently flattered that their wives cared enough to go to such effort. And some, interestingly, seem to have found the whole thing arousing. The idea that their wives had done something so intimate and secret for them created its own kind of erotic charge. There is a wonderful passage in a 15th century French romance where a character discovers that his wife has been using body-kneaded bread, and instead of being horrified, he finds himself deeply moved by the evidence of her desire for him. The text describes him looking at her with new eyes, seeing her not as a dutiful wife but as a woman with her own needs and schemes and passion. It is a surprisingly tender moment in what is otherwise a fairly bawdy tale. What all of these practices reveal is that medieval ideas about aphrodisiacs were deeply tied to ideas about intimacy, connection, and the transfer of essence from one body to another. It was not enough to take an external substance, a plant or potion. The most powerful aphrodisiacs were the ones that created a personal link between two specific people. This is very different from our modern conception of aphrodisiacs, which tend to be things that work on anyone. Medications, supplements, foods with certain nutrients. Medieval aphrodisiacs were bespoke, personal, crafted for a specific relationship. They were as much about magic and meaning as about chemistry. And in a strange way they were more honest about what desire really involves. Because desire is not just biology, is it? It is connection, attention, intention. It is one person choosing to think about another, to work for another, to make themselves vulnerable to another. The medieval wife kneading bread against her skin was performing all of those actions, creating desire through the ritual, even if the mechanism was not what she thought it was. Of course, we also have to acknowledge the manipulation inherent in these practices. Giving someone food or drink laced with your bodily substances without their knowledge is, at best, ethically questionable. Medieval moralists understood this, which is why they categorized it as a minor sin. It violated the principle of consent, even if the intention was to improve the marriage rather than harm the husband. But we should be careful about judging too harshly. These women lived in a world where their security, Their social standing, even their physical safety, depended on their ability to maintain their husband's affection and produce children. They had very little power, very few options, and they were doing the best they could with the knowledge and resources available to them. And here is something worth considering. These body recipes, strange as they are, represent a form of female agency in a world that offered women very little of it. These were not recipes written by male doctors and imposed on women. They were knowledge created by women, for women, passed down through female networks. They gave women a sense of control, however illusory, over their own fates. So yes, it is deeply weird to think about medieval wives kneading bread dough on their naked bodies. It is strange to imagine honey being poured and scraped, chickpeas sprouting in mouths, hairs being collected and hidden. But it is also deeply human. These were people loving, hoping, struggling, and trying to find solutions to problems that still trouble us today. How to maintain desire in long-term relationships, how to overcome fertility challenges, how to feel powerful in situations where you have little power. The body recipes show us medieval people at their most vulnerable and most creative, using what they had because they could not afford what they did not have. And in that, there is something we can relate to, even across the centuries. But we have been focusing on what ordinary people did in private, the small magics of household and kitchen. What about the wealthy and powerful? What happened when queens and nobles needed aphrodisiacs? When you have unlimited resources and desperate need, where do you turn? What are you willing to try when the fate of kingdoms depends on producing an heir? For that story, we need to meet one of the most remarkable women of the Renaissance, a queen who tried everything, absolutely everything, to overcome infertility. Her story involves ingredients we have already discussed and some we have not yet encountered. It involves royal physicians, Italian apothecaries, ultimately a kind of desperate courage that commands respect, even when the methods make us wince. Catherine de' Medici is waiting for us, and her quest for an heir will show us just how far medieval and Renaissance medicine was willing to go. The difference between a peasant woman kneading bread on her skin and a queen drinking mule urine is not as great as you might think. Desperation looks the same whether you are wearing homespun wool or ermine and silk. But when you are a queen, when the fate of nations depends on your ability to produce an heir, desperation takes on a scale and intensity that is almost unimaginable. Let me introduce you to a 14-year-old girl arriving in France in 1533. Her name is Caterina Maria Romola de' Medici, though the French will call her Catherine. She is small, plain-faced by the standards of the time, and despite coming from one of the wealthiest banking families in Italy, she is arriving in France essentially as damaged goods. Her uncle, Pope Clement VII, has arranged this marriage to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis I. It is meant to be a triumph, a Medici becoming French royalty. But within months of the wedding, Pope Clement dies, and suddenly Catherine's position becomes precarious. The enormous dowry that was promised. The new pope, not being family, sees no reason to pay it. King Francis is reported to have said quite bluntly, "The girl has come to me stark naked," meaning she arrived with nothing, no money, no political value, no useful alliances. Catherine's only value now is her ability to produce children, specifically sons, heirs to continue the Valois dynasty. This is not just about personal fulfillment or family legacy. This is about her survival. If she cannot have children, she will be divorced, sent back to Italy in disgrace, and likely spend the rest of her life in a convent. Everything depends on getting pregnant. So imagine being 14, 15, 16 years old in a foreign country where they mock your accent, married to a man who barely looks at you because he's besotted with his mistress. Diane de Poitiers, a woman 20 years his senior. Every month that passes without pregnancy is a month closer to ruin. Every year is another chance for the whispers to grow louder. She is barren, she is cursed, she should be set aside. 10 years pass, 10 years of desperate hope and bitter disappointment. 10 years of court physicians examining her, of nobles speculating about her failure, of watching her husband spend his nights with his mistress while she lies alone wondering what is wrong with her body. And this is where Catherine's story intersects with everything we have learned about medieval aphrodisiacs and fertility treatments. Because Catherine tried everything, and I mean everything. She had the resources of the French royal treasury and the desperation of a woman facing ruin. That is a dangerous combination. The court chronicler Brantôme, who knew Catherine personally in her later years, wrote about this period in her life with a mixture of sympathy and fascination. He notes that many people advised the king and the Dauphin to repudiate her, to end the marriage and find a more fertile wife. Divorce was discussed openly at court. Catherine knew her time was running out, so what did she try? Let us start with the ingredients we have already met. Mandrake. Yes, absolutely. The royal apothecaries prepared mandrake tinctures for her. We know this from household accounts that survive, listing purchases of mandragora root along with other medicinal supplies. Spanish fly. The records are less clear on this, probably because it was so dangerous that physicians were careful about documenting its use, but several historians believe she tried cantharidin preparations as well. But Catherine went far beyond what we have discussed so far. She consulted astrologers who told her which days and times were most auspicious for conception. She visited holy shrines, praying to saints associated with fertility. She wore amulets blessed by priests. She followed special diets prescribed by physicians. And when none of that worked, she turned to remedies that can only be described as horrifying. According to multiple sources, including court physicians who documented the treatments they prescribed, Catherine tried drinking mule urine. Yes, you heard that correctly. Mule urine was believed to have powerful effects on fertility, though the reasoning behind this is genuinely unclear. Perhaps because mules themselves are sterile, there was some inverted logic that their urine could cure sterility. Medieval medical theory could twist itself into remarkable knots. But it gets worse. Poultices. These were pastes or ointments that were applied directly to the body, specifically to what the sources delicately call Catherine's source of life, meaning her genitals. And what were these poultices made of? Hold on to your stomach for this. Ground stag antlers, cow dung, earthworms that have been crushed into paste, powdered periwinkle flowers, all of this mixed with mare's milk to create something you could actually spread on skin without it just falling off. Can you imagine? This young woman, the Queen of France, lying in her chambers while physicians applied a paste of cow dung and crushed worms to the most intimate parts of her body, all in the desperate hope that it would help her conceive. The sources are quite specific about this. One account describes Catherine having these poultices applied above her navel as well, creating...
Dear friends, if this story brought you even a little peace tonight, just imagine how many more relaxing bedtime stories are waiting for you on this channel. So, please like this video, share it with someone who also loves calm stories, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Make sure to turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to know whenever a new story is uploaded. And now, YouTube has introduced something new. It's called Hype. By giving our channel a little hype, you can help us reach so many more people who need rest and relaxation. Your support truly means the world. Finally, let us know in the comments how tonight's story felt for you. Every single word of feedback inspires us to create more magical bedtime journeys. Sweet dreams, and